resilient parasite. An idea.
The first section we're going to be looking at exactly why there might be an issue and defining the issue. But predominantly 80% of this course is just looking at solutions to the problem. In order for me to map the solutions for you properly in a way that you'll actually absorb and remember, instead of just watching this video and then going, that was interesting, and forgetting about it, I need you to understand the problem at a slightly deeper, more nuanced level than you might have thought about it previously. So you're trying to get shit done. And what the problem is as you're trying to get shit done, when you're trying to adult like a boss, you're going into a state of overwhelm. And this manifests differently for different people. So overwhelm might manifest as anxiety for some. It might be extremely severe, pronounced procrastination that you just feel like you can't break out of. Procrastination. It might actually be as dramatic as some kind of acting out or a temper tantrum for some people. It might be feeling very sad. We'll put this in the dramatic section, you know, sobbing in the car park at the supermarket, that kind of thing, because they didn't have the soy milk that you wanted. Sometimes it can manifest as simply getting extremely stressed when you just think about a list of tasks to do, and then that breaking down into perfectionism. And because it can't be perfect, you can end up just giving up and not even attempting it. So there's a sliding scale here of responses, but they all come down to overwhelm. The response might be just not even trying because you feel so frozen with perfectionism and procrastination you don't want to do it at all. Or you might be the type of person who tries and then ends up feeling very, very sad and breaking down into depression. Or you might be somebody who rages out or is just riddled with anxiety. This is very common. It's very, very normal. Most people, even though they might seem to be fine, are going through some of the varieties of these responses to stress on a daily basis. So don't think that if you're stuck in any one of these, that makes you odd or broken in some way. It's a sliding scale. This is just the state of humanity. We have to deal with stress, and our responses to stress are not always extremely effective or subtle, because they're usually related to a kind of biological survival mechanism that isn't about trying to efficiently buy your favorite brand of soy milk at the shop. It's about not being eaten alive by a saber-toothed tiger. So your response is not always appropriate. It's not always effective. So what we're trying to deal with today is overwhelm. But one of the things that you need to look at is where the overwhelm is coming from. There is a tendency, and it's not a particularly useful tendency, to over-pathologize problems and to turn everything into a kind of a psychiatric disorder, which is not necessary. But what we do need to have an understanding of is how stress manifests and how it affects different people in different ways. I don't believe that there is a genetic cause to this. I think it is learned. But stress, when it actually is building up inside of a person, depending on where that person is up to, can have a different effect. So if you imagine you have like a cup, I am not good at drawing. You didn't need me to tell you I'm not good at drawing, because you can see from this diagram that I'm not good at drawing. But that is a cup, I assure you. For some people, this is the amount of stress they can hold and handle, and there's no problem. If it goes down, they'll be more relaxed. If it goes up, they'll struggle a little bit more. And not until it starts to spill out over the top do we see any of this, the results of overwhelm, the multiple manifestations of the overwhelm response. So most people, or probably the mean statistically, the average person, it will work for them like this. There'll be a certain amount of stress they can deal with, and then once it gets past a certain point, it will spill over, and then they'll go into one of these responses. And people have a preferred response. So People with a tendency to be anxious will move towards anxiety. People with a tendency towards rage will temper tantrum. People with a tendency towards perfectionism and freezing will procrastinate and do nothing, and so on and so forth. There is, however, another state that can occur where people have broken boundaries. So inside of the ego formation, inside of the personality, there are little breaks in the ego boundaries. Tiny little breaks, not major trauma, not major violent, dramatic incidents in life, just multiple tiny incidents of boundary breaking. They could be, boundary breaking could be grief, it could be verbal abuse, it could be guilting or shaming by a parent or an authority figure when you're very young. But all of these things can cause little micro tears in the personality. And the ego boundaries start to fragment. And that means that you might show up on different days with a different capacity for stress. So on some days you'll have the cup that is unbroken, and then on other days you'll have all these little breaks. What does that mean? It means that you will start to go into overwhelm even if the stress is very, very low. And you may find that on the Monday you could deal with this much stress and there was no problem. You just bounced right the way through it, singing merrily as you went. And then on the Tuesday, you have this much stress, and it starts to flow out through these porous boundary breaks, and then you go straight into overwhelm over the smallest thing. This is very, very common in my line of work when I'm coaching people. You know, they might have a high-pressure job where they're doing something that most people simply can't do. Most humans can't tolerate that level of stress that they would happily and comfortably deal with on a daily basis. And then they are surprised and they feel ashamed of themselves when a comparatively minor incident will cause this overwhelm effect. What's happening there, though, is something that is a little bit more complicated. We're talking about micro tears in the ego boundaries of the personality that mean our ability to deal with stress is diminished. We can't hold as much stress before it tips over and we have the overwhelm response. There's something to consider here, just as a possibility, and I ask you this to consider it philosophically in your own time. Do you notice that, or have you noticed at any point in your life that maybe you have a diminished capacity to do what other people can do quite easily? So for example, going to university lecture, going to the shops, going to the bank, whatever it is, you notice other people do that and they seem to be absolutely fine. But when you do that, you'll get a response from it afterwards. You might be extremely tired afterwards, you might be very irritable afterwards, or you might find yourself totally spaced out, totally dissociated. So do you notice you have a diminished capacity doing things that other people seem to find quite easy and having some kind of a response to that, like being very tired, very irritable, or very zoned out, which is how normal people, non-psychiatrists, describe dissociation, just zoned out. You just start tuning out. Daydreaming. You can't stop yourself from daydreaming. Have you noticed that you have a diminished capacity for that? And have you ever seen yourself having a very variable tolerance for stress from one day to the next? Where one day, like I said, on the Monday, you can deal with it, you can deal with a lot, and then on the Tuesday, your tolerance for stress goes right the way down. If this rings a bell for you, and you think, yeah, that kind of does sound like me. There are days where I experience a little bit of stress, or I do something that other people seem to be able to do quite easily, but I find myself giving up, or freezing, or becoming extremely sad, then there's a possibility that there might be an effect of accumulated stress and trauma over the years inside of you that has been untreated. This is very normal. I have not met a human being who isn't dealing with a certain level of traumatic response, meaning traumas occur in life. As all the great religions teach us, life is suffering. So whether it's Christianity or it's Buddhism or Judaism, wherever it is, there's always something there to try and help humans deal with the fact that life is tough, that there is suffering. Freud said it's trauma. Jung agreed. It's all a form of trauma, but trauma leaves marks, it leaves dents. And we then have to try and deal with that. We carry those wounds as best as we can. And you might think, well, my childhood was okay. It really wasn't that bad. It's not like I was left out in the rain or beaten or starved or anything. That's fine. And it might not come from childhood. But there are many things in life that we can experience that actually leave us in a state of shock, in a state of a post-traumatic shocked state. It can be as simple as encountering an experience that you are not prepared for. If you're just not prepared for it, that can leave you in a state of shock. And then the brain goes, ooh, and it glitches. And it goes, right, I don't know how to deal with that. I know I'll use a response to the fact that I'm overwhelmed by shock, and I'll just start relying on that as a response. It then becomes a habit. So the shock and the stress of the overwhelm then will have you going, oh, I'm going to be anxious in order to deal with it. I'm going to be hypervigilant, hyper alert, and I'm going to be really, really anxious. Or I'm just going to procrastinate, never do anything, self-isolate, stay at home. Or I'm going to be extremely dramatic, start crying all the time, asking for help. Or I'm going to demand things and throw temper tantrums and be angry. These then become, over time, habits. They're there to help us deal with the overwhelm that we might be experiencing as a result of multiple traumas. So when a person is carrying multiple traumas that they've not really identified over time, it becomes a kind of post-traumatic stress, but it's not based on one incident. So it's called it's complex post-traumatic stress. So the cause of the stress is complex. It might be environmental, it could be contextual, and then the response is complex because it usually manifests as some variation of an overwhelm response, a stress response, an inability to deal with stress, which then becomes habitual. Because if it kind of works for you, you'll always stick to it. The parts of the brain that are there to deal with survival are activated by stress. The stress of traffic activates animalistic parts of the brain that deal with survival in the context of famine, genocide, disease, natural disasters, volcanoes erupting and being burnt to death by lava. Not really appropriate if the only issue you're facing is a parking fine. But that is where the brain and the body goes to. We don't, no animal evolves in a completely linear fashion at incremental levels. We evolve as best we can based on what? Based on trauma. What causes animals to evolve? Any animal, trauma. We respond to the stresses of the environment. The weak ones die, and so they're no longer around to propagate. And the ones who adapt, we usually refer to them as the strong, even if their survival strategy is maladaptive, is not that helpful, they're the ones who continue. Okay, so we can end up with a whole series of not great survival mechanisms. These survival mechanisms that might have helped you get by in childhood or in the stressful environment in which they were developed are not ideal to allow you to thrive and live a really good life and get shit done as a grown-up, as an adult. So they need to be dealt with. So you might consider the possibility that you're carrying multiple traumas that's given you a diminished capacity for stress and a variable tolerance to deal with stress. What I'm going to show you today is some strategies that allow you to, if you implement them, will allow you to get shit done without the overwhelm, without the drama, without breaking down and everything else. And hopefully it should make it so that you can get everything done in your life, you can feel motivated, you can feel energized, and you can do it in a way that is calm and focused and easy and fun. Thank you.